the greatest novelist. He was certainly one of the greatest storytellers of all time. And in terms of London, he knew it like the back of his hand. For those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Simon Whitehouse. I'm a London Blue Badge tourist guide, and just show you my badge here. And as a tourist guide, you know, we are the storytellers of London today. So I always like to think of myself when I'm walking through the streets of London, showing visitors around our wonderful city, that pretty much anywhere I go, I'll be walking in the footsteps of Charles Dickens. And in a sense, as well as being this phenomenal writer, he was also, I suppose he was a tourist guide, because he would take visitors on walks all over London. He would actually point out the locations of where he'd set the novels and the characters. So that's what I want to try and do a little bit of today on our virtual tour. And you'll notice on the display there, I've put Dickens' birthday. That's what we're really celebrating. I've put my details up there if you want to follow me on Twitter, or you want to drop me an email. This is brought to you today in conjunction with London Walks, which is the oldest and the best walking tour company in the whole of London. Many of you will know London Walks. Many of you have been perhaps with London Walks. And I'm delighted to tell you we have a special guest today who's going to join us a little bit later on in our Dickens virtual tour. So yeah, so I think without further ado, Robert, are we all set?
Yep, y'all are. Take it away. Thank you.
Fantastic. I just wanted to show you those two images there of Dickens, and we will see them again during the presentation. But the Dickens that we're more familiar with is the image on the right, I think, with Dickens there, of course, reading out loud with his beard. That's what I think defines Dickens for many people visually. But he didn't grow the beard until the early 1850s. And so I put that image on the left, which is a painting which shows Dickens as a young man. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that painting a little bit later, because it links in directly to one of the novels. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to start, and I hope you enjoy the tour. So here we go. Right. Now, you may think, there we go. This is a strange place to start in many ways. I'm showing you Charles Dickens' grave. Well, where is Charles Dickens' grave to be found? It's to be found in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, the Royal Church right in the heart of London. And that photograph was taken in 2012, which marked the bicentenary of the birth of Dickens, 1812 to 2012. And that's a photograph of Dickens about 3 years before he died. And you can see he didn't look very well. He wasn't very well. He was much older than his years. He was only 58 when he died. And the reason I reference his death was because he didn't want to be buried in Westminster Abbey. In fact, he wanted to be buried in Rochester in Kent, which is where he'd spent the happiest years of his life. He wanted a very quiet, very low-key funeral, but it was not to be. The nation, including his best friend, John Forster, the Times newspaper, even Queen Victoria really sort of got involved and campaigned for him to be laid to rest in Poets' Corner. And the official record tells us that 14 people were in attendance at Dickens' funeral, although the Westminster Abbey archives actually tell us 13. So there's a mystery there. And we think that's because there was a lady present at Dickens' funeral, the lady known as the Invisible Woman of Charles Dickens' life. Some of you might know what I'm talking about at this point. If you don't know, all will be revealed, but not just yet. In true Dickens cliffhanger style, I'm going to leave you on that little cliffhanger. But for 3 days, the grave was left open before it was sealed, because it allowed people to pay their respects, and people walked from all over London to pay their respects to the man that they saw, quite rightly, as their great hero. But that's the end of the story in a sense. So we need to go really back to the beginning. And although Dickens, we associate Dickens, of course, with London, every single novel except one has some or most of its scene set in London, Dickens was not a native Londoner. And let's go and see where he was born. This beautiful photograph is an aerial view of Portsmouth, which is a seaport, a great seaport on the south coast of England. And back in the early 19th century, this was one of the most important cities in England because it was the headquarters of the Royal Navy. And don't forget, 1812, the year that Dickens is born, we are in the thick of the Napoleonic Wars. And this is serving and supplying the great warships and indeed the sailors going off to fight in the Napoleonic Wars. And this is the house in Portsmouth where Charles Dickens was born. So remember, he's born on Friday, the 7th of February, 1812. So he always considered Friday to be an auspicious day, a lucky day for him. And he was the second child of 8. His parents were John and Elizabeth Dickens. He wasn't the firstborn. He had an older sister called Fanny, although he was the first male child. And his father worked for the Navy. So John Dickens was a civil servant, and the family were what we would describe as lower middle class. On his mum's side, his mum came from slightly better stock, actually, quite well educated, although his maternal grandfather actually had sort of rather dark secrets. In fact, he'd also worked for the Navy office and had defrauded them and ended up fleeing to France. So it's quite interesting that the Dickens family sort of harbored these secrets. And, you know, at least one person, if not several people, are harboring secrets in Dickens' novels. So that's quite interesting. Now, that's where Dickens was born, and the family did move around a fair bit. But by 10 years old, Dickens and the family were living in Chatham in Kent. So that was another naval town. But father and mother and older sister had moved up to London in 1822. And this is where they moved to. And this is 16 Bayham Street, which was in Camden Town. The house no longer exists today, so northwest London. And Dickens does not join them here in Camden initially because he is completing his elementary education down in Chatham in Kent. But when he does finally arrive, just before the age of 11, to join them here, he arrives by stagecoach. And that's very interesting because, you know, it's still the era of the stagecoach before the railways have arrived. And when he writes David Copperfield also arrives into London via the stagecoach. And so Dickens, of course, well, David Copperfield being the most autobiographical of all the novels. Now, at the time, this area where this house was located was on the edge of London. And when Dickens arrived here, you could still access all of built-up London on foot. Everybody walked. Imagine that. I mean, quite literally, it was 4 miles from east to west London. That was the built-up area, and you could walk from one side to the other in about 2 hours. By the end of the 19th century, so after Dickens had died, it had changed dramatically. And in fact, it was about 32 miles from east to west, and it would have taken you all day to walk across. And you also see this massive population increase from 1 million people in 1800 to 2.5 million people by 1850 to 3.5 million by 1870 and 6 million by 1900. So there are huge changes that take place during Dickens' lifetime, and Dickens charts these changes as he goes. So this house was overlooking the countryside. Hard to imagine today, but these are examples of dust heaps, these great big piles of dirt and dust that you would have found all over London. This was actually a famous one on the site of where King's Cross railway station is today. So that's hard to imagine that, isn't it? But just to give you a sense of what London was. And in 1829, we get the first omnibus. So the first, what we would call, I suppose, a public bus service, of course, 1829. And this is, of course, horse-drawn. And of course, remember, everything is horse-powered until the railways arrive in the 1830s. 50,000 horses on the streets of London every day. That's £45 of feces being deposited on the streets, £3.5 of urine, a total of 37,000 tonnes of dung on those streets every year. So Dickens would have been 17 years old when this bus service launched. And of course, the horses, cause terrible traffic jams, and at least 3 or 4 people die a week due to traffic accidents. Just to fast forward to this image, this is a photograph of High Street, Kensington in West London, taken in 1865, so 5 years before Dickens dies. And what you see, and this is all linked to the horses, can you see here on the left, these gentlemen are crossing sweepers. Now, crossing sweepers were people that cleared the mud and the rubbish and the dung from the middle of the streets to the sides to create a clear central route. If you think about the clerks that worked in the city, people like Bob Cratchit, they want to arrive, with clean boots and clean trousers. So that sort of helped that. Many of the people, of course, that were working were young children. And there's a minor character in Bleak House called Joe, who is indeed a crossing sweeper. And he was coatless, hatless, barefoot. And also he runs errands for, people and does odd jobs. And he dies very tragically, poor Joe, of pneumonia. So that's High Street, Kensington, very upmarket area of West London. Not just the horses, of course, but 40,000 tonnes of dung deposited by cattle, sheep, calves and pigs. This is the Smithfield meat market. So all the animals were driven here. They were driven, they were slaughtered and they were sold. And this shows you the very last day of the open market. It was replaced in the 1850s by a covered market. And we get a wonderful description of literally walking through the manure and the terrible smell in Oliver Twist. These are just a few more images of Victorian London. This shows you the tanneries, so the leather industry, which is also a very smelly industry on the south bank of the River Thames. This is the Victorian London Bridge that Dickens would have seen being built in the 1830s. That's the bridge, by the way, that ended up in Arizona in the 1960s. Punch and Judy shows, so street entertainment. The Underground Railway being built in the 1860s, towards the end of Dickens' life. The riverbank here, which will also see lots of changes. So I'm just showing you, just to remind ourselves of what Victorian London looked like. And of course, the other really big development that we see is the development of the railways. And this is a railway map from 1899. So this shows you how much of London is covered by railways. Remember, the railway doesn't actually start until the 1826 up in the north of England. By 1836, the year that Dickens writes the Pickwick Papers, his first full-length novel, that's when we get the first railway in London. Actually, not that any of us traveling on the train at the moment, but if I were traveling on the train, I travel from my home here in southeast London, and I still travel on that same Victorian railway into London Bridge. So there we are, we're still traveling on these Victorian railways. And by 1870, again, when Dickens dies, all of these other networks that you can see all over the map, all these other rail lines coming from the north and the east and the south, they're all in place by that time. So again, massive changes. Dombey and Son, if any of you know that Dickens novel, is a novel which talks a lot about the development of the railways. Now, Dickens arrives, as I said, in Camden Town, joins the family. His father has been in and out of debt for most of his life. And he ends up in this place in 1822, 1823. This is the Marshalsea Debtors Prison. And this is where you were taken to if you couldn't clear your debts, and you stayed there until you managed to get out of your debt and you could pay your way. So John Dickens, Elizabeth Dickens, and Fanny are in the Marshalsea prison. But Dickens, being 10, nearly 11 years old, the only boy at this point, is in fact the only child that can work. So he, in fact, is sent to work. Now, I'm going to explain a bit more about that in a moment. But I just wanted to show you where we can still find a remnant of this debtors' prison. This is an aerial view of an area called Borough, which is on the south side of the River Thames, just south of London Bridge. This church, which is called St. George's church is featured in Little Dorrit, and that's because the novel Little Dorrit features this prison. And where the little arrow is, just there, the white arrow, you can just see there's a wall, and that is the only surviving wall of the debtors' prison, the Marshalsea prison. Now, hopefully this will work for everybody. I'm just going to play a little video here. Forgive me if it's a little bit glitchy, but it's actually, I recorded this a little while ago, a few months ago, with me just outside the wall of the prison. So fingers crossed, it will play okay. No, it didn't seem to want to play. Sorry about that. Right, don't know what's happened there. I shall rectify that. Well, just, you have to in this now, folks. Just around here to the right is the wall that you saw from the aerial view of the Marshalsea prison. And what's really important about the Marshalsea prison is that Dickens, although he wasn't living in the prison with the family, he was lodging with a landlady. A lady actually called Mrs. Roylance, so I'm going to talk about more in a moment. And he would visit the family on Sundays because the other 6 days of the working week, Dickens was put to work. And this is where Dickens was working. And this is a sketch of what was known as Warren's Blacking Factory. And Warren's Blacking Factory sat on the right at the edge of the River Thames, which was much wider than it is today. And this blacking factory was where they manufactured blacking, which was used for blackening Victorian fire grates, but also for polishing boots and shoes. And young boys, aged 10, 11, thereabouts, were put to work pasting the labels onto the jars of blacking. Now, the job itself wasn't so arduous, but the conditions were absolutely appalling. And they were working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in these damp, rat-infested, fetid buildings overlooking the river. And of course, the river itself, remember, would have been toxic at this time. There's an image there on the right of the Grim Reaper rowing in his boat along the River Thames. And their very famous quote said that he who drinks a tumbler of London water has more animate beings in him than there are men, women, and children on the face of the globe. Now, of course, why is this? Well, because, of course, the population, remember, is going from 1 million to 2 million to 3 million. It's basically doubling every 20 years. You have, of course, homes that don't have any modern sanitation. So you have cesspits, and these cesspits overflow, and all of the waste goes directly into the river. And of course, we get terrible diseases like cholera, one of the biggest killers in the Victorian era, and people are drinking the river water as well. So this is extremely dangerous. By the 1860s, a modern sewage system is created by a man called Joseph Bazalgette, one of the great heroes of Victorian London. And this shows you, in fact, a view of the River Thames with the new embankments running along the edge, with, in fact, the brand new sewers that Bazalgette laid running underneath. And they still run underneath London today. And we're still mightily grateful to Mr. Bazalgette. So and the cholera was eradicated virtually overnight as a result of the embankments. So this is something that Dickens just about survives to see being built in his lifetime. So this impact of Dickens working in this factory, in this blacking factory, it had a huge impact on him. And there's just an image of the kind of characters that Dickens creates, of course. You know, you think of, Oliver Twist, perhaps most famously. You think Pip in Great Expectations. You think of David Copperfield. They're all children that have been abandoned in some way or another. And that's how Dickens felt. Of course, he felt completely abandoned by his family, even though this was a very necessary means of, helping the family out of debt. I just wanted to show you this image because we have to have a little bit of reading from Dickens, I think, just to remind ourselves what a wonderful writer he was. When Dickens was working in the factory, he was lodging with a lady called Mrs. Roylance in Camden Town. And although he claimed that he never used real people as inspiration for his characters, He definitely did. And she inspired Mrs. Pipchin, who is a character in Dombey and Son. And I'm just going to read a little bit of the description of Mrs. Pipchin from the novel. This celebrated Mrs. Pipchin was a marvellous, ill-favoured, ill-conditioned old lady, of a stooping figure with a mottled face like bad marble, a hook nose, and a hard grey eye that looked as if it might have been hammered at an anvil without sustaining any injury. 40 years had at least had elapsed since the death of Mr. Pipchin, but his relic still wore black bombazine of such a lustreless, deep, dead, sombre shade that gas itself could not light her up after dark. I mean, what a wonderful, sort of sketch of a personality just in a few lines. Absolutely terrific. If we want to sort of see where this blacking factory is today, well, this is the underneath the arches of Charing Cross railway station. Those of you that know London will know that, and that gives us the closest sense of what that part of Victorian London was like. Now, Dickens came out of the factory after a year. He did go back into school for about a year, and after the age of 15, Dad got into debt again, and Dickens was forced to go to work. And he ended up working as a trainee solicitor, at what was known as an articled clerk in one of the 4 Inns of Court in London. And during this time, actually, ever since a child, he developed a great love for the theatre. And this is an image of the what was the Adelphi Theatre on the left-hand side. The Adelphi Theatre is still there today on the same site, but it's a different building. And he always went particularly to see an actor called Charles Matthews, who gave these very, very famous monologues in which he played lots of different characters in one single evening. And Dickens really, became, an actor of a very professional standard. He actually put on plays in his homes, and at heart, that's who Dickens was. And he gets that first taste as a very young man in London. Dickens becomes self-educated. He goes to the British Museum, to the reading room, and starts to now really fill in the gaps in the education. He gets a job as a journalist after working at the at Gray's Inn, which, by the way, he hated the legal profession, and he gets his revenge on it in Bleak House. But he becomes a reporter, a journalist for this newspaper called the Mirror of Parliament. And one of the things that Dickens would have witnessed is the burning of the Parliament buildings in 1834. So the Houses of Parliament that we know today are not the buildings that Dickens knew. The ones that we know are rebuilt after the fire. When he was 20 years old, Dickens went here. Now, this building looks a bit like the British Museum, but in fact, it is the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, not the Opera House that we know today, because this ends up burning down in 1856. But Dickens wrote to the theatre manager when it was then still known as the Covent Garden Theatre, and he wanted to audition for the theatre company. And he didn't end up going to the audition because he ended up with a terrible cold. He suffered a multitude of illnesses, Dickens, and he ended up having to write and ask for postponement. And he never went back. So it's very interesting that that's kind of those sliding doors moments, isn't it? Had he gone for the audition, had he become an actor, maybe we wouldn't have all these wonderful novels that we have today. But while he's writing for the newspaper, he's also trying out, if you like, creative writing. And he eventually gets these creative stories published. And this is called Sketches by Bose. Bose was a nickname that Dickens adopted. And basically, these sketches are street sketches of everyday life in London. And I've put an image there on the right of an area which we know today as Seven Dials, which today is a very funky, trendy neighborhood with lots of lovely independent shops. But it was one of the worst slum districts in London at that time. And one of the many, many examples I can give you of the sketches is the gin shops, of which there were many in Seven Dials. And Dickens observed that these gin shops had bright lights and etched glass in the window. and they tempted, of course, the poorest people inside, because people lived in terrible, filthy, dirty slums. And Dickens was, he said, the more splendid these places become, the more popular they are with the poor. And people really enjoyed these sketches of everyday London life. And Dickens manages to be earning enough money at this point to move into this rather nice building called Fernival's Inn, which was it was a mix of things, but they had sort of bachelor pads really for single young gentlemen. And he moves in with his brother Fred, and I'll show you in a minute the building that sits on the site of where this is. It was actually part of the Inns of Court. But in 1836, Dickens is approached to write a series of captions to accompany some illustrations about the adventures of a man called Mr. Pickwick. And this is the beginning of the Pickwick Papers, or the posthumous papers of the Pickwick Club. And you can see an image of Mr. Pickwick there on the right, skating on the ice. And Mr. Pickwick is this rather jolly character who travels around the country on a stagecoach with his friends, but ends up, in fact, in a debtor's prison. So we can see where Dickens gets that idea from. And the first epic Dickens would publish in monthly installments and then later in weekly installments. And it's interesting that in the first 3 installments, it sold well, but not that well. But by the 4th month, Dickens introduced another character into the story, a character called Sam Weller, who was the Cockney valet of Mr. Pickwick. And Sam spoke the everyday language of normal working class people, and people suddenly, ordinary people, identified with this Cockney character. And suddenly, from 10,000 copies a month, Dickens was selling 40,000 copies of the Pickwick Papers, it launched a whole. I mean, there were play versions of the story within months of it being published. There was memorabilia, souvenirs, hats, coats, cigars, joke books. You think about, merchandise today. Well, that all started with Dickens. And this is an image of a wonderful tavern, which we still have in the city of London, called the Georgian Vulture. And the Georgian Vulture is featured in the Pickwick Papers. Mr. Pickwick is forced to take rooms here when, in fact, he's involved in a legal dispute with his landlady. But that's the Georgian Vulture. And the Pickwick Club, by the way, meet there in December every year to celebrate and raise a toast, have dinner, Christmas dinner, to celebrate Charles Dickens. Fernival's Inn, where Dickens was living, is now this building. It's called Hobon Bars, and mostly it's occupied by legal firms. But the building itself is a late 19th century building, a wonderful building built by a man called Whitehouse, who also designed and built the Natural History Museum. And there is, in fact, if I were to take you there, take you right through, there's a bust of Dickens right in the back of this this great big office block. The success of the Pickwick Papers enables Dickens to get married. And he marries this lovely looking lady. This is Catherine Hogarth, and she happens to be the daughter of George Hogarth, who is the editor of another newspaper called the Evening Chronicle that Dickens was also working for. And this is now an overview of an area of London which many of you will know. This is Bloomsbury. Right here is the British Museum, which of course is where Dickens had gone to the reading room to improve his education. But over here on the west side of, on the east side of Bloomsbury, is a street called Dowty Street. And this is very important because this is where Dickens moves to with his wife after they have their first child, because they're not allowed to have children in that bachelor pad. I'm just going to, for some reason, I'm just going to come out of this room. I'm going to stop sharing because I noticed that my animations just are not quite working as I want them to. So there's a couple of things. I'm just going to try and share again. So just give me a moment to do that. That's it. Oh, let's just cancel that. Sorry, it's going to take a minute to do it. There we are. Let's do it again.
Big turnout today, Simon. There's 1,000 people watching you on Zoom and many more on Facebook.
That's fantastic. That's great to hear. Great. Okay. Excellent. Yes, for some reason, I just couldn't get that. So the reason I wanted to do that was because I want to now show you a close-up of the only surviving home of Charles Dickens in London, and it is number 48 Dowty Street, and it's where Dickens lived for nearly 3 years with his wife, his firstborn child, also Charlie, and in fact they would go on to have 2 further children in this house, and in fact they will have 10 children altogether. But this is today the Charles Dickens Museum, and it's one of the greatest museums in London. Not only does he complete the Pickwick Papers here, but halfway through writing the Pickwick Papers, and this is what makes Dickens so extraordinary, he embarks on a second novel, and it's completely different from the first one, and it's called Oliver Twist. I think we all know Oliver Twist. And of course, it's very important because it's based on Dickens' own experience of working in Parliament, where he was, remember, a reporter, and he would have seen the effects of what was known as the Poor Law Reform Act. And essentially, the Poor Law Reform Act made the lives of the poorest people in England even worse than they had been. So now they weren't allowed to accept what we now call welfare, I suppose, payments from the parish. They were forced to go into workhouses. And we all remember, of course, the famous scene depicted there when Oliver's in the workhouse asking for more. So Dickens is drawing attention to the horrors that this Act of Parliament created. I want to just show you this location because this is Field Lane, which was one of the worst slum districts in the city. It was just a little way from Fernival's Inn, so Dickens would have known it very well. And what's important about this is where Fagin's den was located. So this is where Oliver joins the gang of pickpockets that are employed by Fagin. And today that's the road that runs on the site of where Field Lane was. It's called Saffron Hill, and it's on the edge of the jewelry quarter, Hatton Garden, where you get all the diamond rings, for weddings and engagements. So it's changed a bit since Dickens' day. Halfway through writing Oliver Twist, which remember is also in monthly installments, Dickens embarks on a third novel, and this is called Nicholas Nickleby. And this was, again, very different story. It's about these awful schools up in Yorkshire where parents effectively packed off their children. The kids were effectively held prisoner and abused, and in fact children went blind with neglect. So again, Dickens really this social commentator, and it sold 50,000 copies on its first installment. And later, in a later edition of the story, Dickens commented that there were very few of these awful schools now in existence. So he really did change. He effected change through his novels. This portrait is called the Nickleby Portrait, and this is in the National Portrait Gallery just off Trafalgar Square. Although, of course, our museums and galleries are closed at the moment, and the Portrait Gallery is closed anyway because it's being refurbished. But this, I love this because it captures Dickens, 28 years old. It captures that fantastic youthful energy, and I love the fact that it's almost spotlit, so the light's coming down and it's sort of illuminating him. And he's also he was a real dandy in his dress. You can see he's wearing rather splendid green trousers and a sort of a Regency cravat. So remember, he's a child of the Regency, even though he is now writing in the Victorian era. And is obviously a Victorian novelist. Now, while he's living at Doughty Street with his wife and with the children, this young lady moved in with the couple. This is actually Dickens' sister-in-law, his wife's sister, Mary Hogarth. And just months after they moved into Doughty Street, tragedy struck because Mary went out with Dickens and his wife to the theatre one evening, and they came back from the theatre. She went upstairs to her bedroom, which you can still see in the Dickens Museum today, and she died at 17 years old. We think possibly now of an aneurysm or some undiagnosed heart condition. But the reason I mention it is it's so important because Dickens was absolutely devastated at his sister-in-law's death. He was extremely close to her. And in fact, he took the ring from her finger and he wore it for the whole of the rest of his life. And there had been rumors that they had some kind of affair, but I mean, that's never been proved. But it did have a huge influence because many of his female characters in the novels are, often at the same age, about 17, 18. They're sort of rather helpless heroines. And in fact, he even went so far as to wanting to be buried next to her when he died. So they had this extraordinarily close relationship. And the reason I mention it is because we're moving to another location now. This is an area sort of sandwiched between Covent Garden and Fleet Street. It's where the London School of Economics is. And where that arrow's pointing, there's a little building with a red roof on the top. And I want to take you down to it. Here it is. This is the Old Curiosity Shop, the building that possibly inspired Dickens' fourth novel. And the death of Mary Hogarth inspired the heroine of the Old Curiosity Shop, Little Nell, one of the most famous heroines in literature. And of course, famously, Little Nell is sick, and she gets sicker and sicker as the installments progress. And Dickens' readers were so, invested in this that they wrote to him and said that he ought to kill her off because they couldn't bear her suffering. In fact, in America, when the sailors got off the ships, they were asked by people waiting on the harbor, "Is Little Nell dead?" It was incredible. And when she died, her death caused a sensation. It broke the heart of the nation, except Oscar Wilde's. And Oscar Wilde said one would have to have a heart of stone to read about the death of Little Nell without crying with laughter. Oscar Wilde thought Dickens was being overly sentimental. But I think it's very important because, it's all about the death of essentially a child. And of course, remember, half the funerals in London in the 19th century were for children under the age of 10. 50% of children didn't make it to their 5th birthday, particularly in the poorer districts. Parents didn't even often give their children names. They christened them, but they didn't call them by a name until they were often 3 years old because they didn't want to get attached to their children. So in a way, I think the Old Curiosity Shop really resonated with parents. And in an age before psychology even existed, perhaps, it helped them with their grief. This is a map of the United States, or the East Coast, mostly of the United States. I'm sure you all know that. But why am I showing you that? Because after he wrote The Old Curiosity Shop, Dickens went to America on a 6-month tour with his wife. He told her they were only going for 2 weeks. And they went on this kind of now legendary tour. You can see where they traveled all over. They got as far as St. Louis, just about seeing the Rocky Mountains. And you've got to remember, by this point, Dickens is an international celebrity. And wherever he went, I mean, he was mobbed by people in America. And he was, balls were held for him, queues of people outside his hotel rooms wherever he went. Absolutely extraordinary. Although he didn't make himself very popular in America because he lectured Americans about the fact that the copyright laws meant that he didn't make any money from his novels in America. And when he came back from this tour, by the way, he traveled by steamship to America, which was, again, a fairly recent invention rather than a sailing ship. So again, he saw all these changes. He comes back and he writes American Notes here on the right-hand side, which was effectively a travel log about his journey. And on the left-hand side, you can see Martin Chuzzlewit, which was his 5th novel. And he told his publishers, "This is the best thing I've ever written." And if you're thinking to yourselves, folks, well, that's the one maybe I haven't yet read. Don't worry if you don't even know it, because it wasn't his most successful. Perhaps because actually it's a 900-page anti-American rant. And in fact, Martin Chuzzlewit, the central character, goes to America because his dad won't give him any money. And yes, I mean, it's quite insulting. He describes the Mississippi as an enormous ditch 2 or 3 miles wide with running liquid mud. And even Mary Shelley, Dickens' friend, said that he'd come back with a very dim view of Americans, largely because he had great hope for America, but he'd also been appalled by, seeing slavery, particularly when he went down towards Virginia at the time. this is that's a photograph, by the way. I just put that in there in the middle of my my American students who I'm missing at the moment because I teach on an American university course, and that's them in front of a fountain, which in fact is featured in Martin Chuzzlewit. And I'll show you what I mean by that. This is the fountain. It's actually within the Inns of Court, where our barristers have their chambers today in these buildings. And Dickens says, he who enters here leaves noise behind. And when you're walking along a noisy London street, when you go into the Middle Temple here, I mean, it's an oasis of tranquility still today. And the fountain, I'll just zoom in on it, says, brilliantly the temple fountain sparkled in the sun, and laughingly its liquid music played, and merrily the idle drops of water danced and danced, and peeping out in sport among the trees, plunged lightly down to hide themselves. There's actually a romance in Martin Chuzzlewit that takes place around the fountain. Now, Martin Chuzzlewit didn't do very well. It just wasn't as good as the other novels had been. So Dickens is in, a bit of financial trouble at this point because he's just taken a mortgage out. They've moved from Dowty Street and they're now much bigger house near Regent's Park, the family. So he has an idea in the middle of 1843 to write a story that's going to deliver a sledgehammer blow, a wake-up call to the people of England to expose things like this. This is an illustration from a parliamentary report about children working in Victorian mines. And this portrait on the right was painted of Dickens while he was in the middle of writing this novel. The novel that he wrote was written in 6 weeks from mid-October to mid-December. You all know it, of course. It's arguably his most famous story. It's A Christmas Carol. And there's an image of the first edition. And it was truly extraordinary because he wanted it not only to be, of course, to wake people up about the awful plight of Victorian children, child labourers, but also he wanted it to be beautiful, and he wanted it to be bound in red leather and have gilt-edged pages. And the publishers say, well, we can't publish this for less than 5 shillings, which would be about £25 today. So it was very expensive. And they refused to pay for the publishing costs. So Dickens was forced to self-publish and actually made very little money initially from Christmas Carol because the production costs were so expensive. But the good news about Christmas, of course, as we know, is that it comes around every year. And eventually Dickens made an awful lot of money from A Christmas Carol, although not actually directly through the sales of the novel, but we'll come to that. In fact, he anticipated making about £1,000 from this, about £100,000 today, but he ended up with about £230. Yeah. This is just an example of a little bit of Christmas Carol that we can still experience in London. This is Simpson's Tavern that we're approaching, and in A Christmas Carol, Dickens tells us that Scrooge takes his usual melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and Simpson's dates to the middle of the 18th century, and that's the one that we believe Dickens has in mind for Christmas Carol. So you can't, if you look at that image, you can't get any more Dickensian than that, image of the shop front of the, the gas lamp, although it's probably an electric lamp today, but there it is. And if I were to really take you on a real life walk, I'd take you right through the heart of these wonderful Dickensian streets. Now, in 1850, Dickens published a magazine called Household Words, which was a quote from Shakespeare's Henry V. Now, he dreamed for years, decades, in fact, of publishing his own magazine, and it was it was very successful. He wrote for it, he edited it, he owned 50% of the shares, he took quite a big salary from it, and the offices of the magazine were located on Wellington Street in Covent Garden, which I'll show you in a few minutes' time. And it not only was it full of articles and short stories, but also essays about the social problems of Victorian London. So housing, education, crime. So Dickens was really writing. He was he was a reformer. He was a social reformer, not just through his novels, but through these sort of magazines as well. Now, this beautiful building is located just around the corner from the old curiosity shop that I showed you, which is a beautiful 17th century building, and it's located on Lincoln's Inn Field. And number 58 on the right-hand side was the home of John Forster. And John Forster was Dickens' best friend and his literary well, he's actually the literary editor of the Examiner, but he became Dickens' literary agent, marketing man, publicist, and best friend. And they met when Dickens was 25 years old, back in 1836. So Dickens would have visited this house very regularly. In 1844, Dickens came back from a holiday in Italy, and he gave a reading of another Christmas story called The Chimes, which he read to John Forster, Thomas Carlyle, of course, the writer of the History of the French Revolution, which inspired Tale of Two Cities, Daniel Maclise, who was the artist that had painted that lovely portrait that I showed you a few minutes ago. And people, they were so amazed by Dickens' ability to bring the story to life that they suggested that he should do this for a living, that he should actually read his novels for the public, which he would, in fact, later go on to do. And it's how, you know, much of the world got to know Dickens through his public readings. Now, the importance of this building is also featured in Bleak House. And this is Bleak House, written in the early 1850s. And the house is the location of a lawyer, or it's the offices of a lawyer called Mr. Tulkinghorn. Now, Dickens hated the legal profession. He hated lawyers because of his experience working for as a trainee solicitor, and he really bashes the lawyers here. And he says, he describes it, he says, the Crow flies straight across Chancery Lane into Lincoln's Inn Fields. Here, in a large house, formerly a house of state, lives Mr. Tulkinghorn. It is let off now in sets of chambers, and in these shrunken fragments of its greatness, lawyers lie like maggots in nuts, which is just fantastic, I think. And also, Mr. Tulkinghorn is found dead in his offices. What also makes Bleak House very interesting is that it's the very earliest example, I think I'm right in saying, of a detective novel, and the first detective in literature appears in Bleak House. The other building or structure that's mentioned in Bleak House is this, which is the Temple Bar, which was once the gateway into the City of London, located on Fleet Street. And the opening of Bleak House, very famous, Dickens says, the raw afternoon is rawest, and the dense fog is densest, and the muddy streets are muddiest, near that leaden-headed old obstruction, appropriate or Temple Bar. So this was the Temple Bar, and he's making a comment, of course, on the leaden-headed corporation headed by the Lord Mayor that run the City of London. Now, the other, and that, by the way, now, in fact, you would find at the entrance to Paternoster Square next to St. Paul's Cathedral. So it was actually relocated in the early 2000s. And this is an aerial view of Lincoln's Inn, which is one of the 4 inns of court. And this building right here, which is actually the oldest part of which is late 15th century, is where the High Court of Chancery was located. And in the opening of Bleak House, Dickens goes on to say, hard by Temple Bar in Lincoln's Inn Hall, at the very heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor in his Court of Chancery. So it's right there. And of course, Dickens is making a comment on the weather in London, the fog, the smogs, these terrible smogs that would grip the city in the winter, caused, of course, by the burning coal fires in domestic grates. And of course, because we had a damp climate, the wet air was heavy, it would push the smoke right down. And of course, we're in a basin in London, so it hung for hours and hours. And it was so thick, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And we still had smogs right until 1956. And of course, he's using the fog as a metaphor for the legal profession, which is thick, impenetrable, and you can't see your way through it. And the legal case that is discussed in Bleak House is the case of Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, which was based on a real life case which had started before Dickens was born, and in fact was not resolved until after Dickens had died. In the 1850s, he also goes on to write David Copperfield, which really is the most autobiographical of all of his novels. And even Dickens, it was pointed out, had switched his own initials round, CD, to give us DC, David Copperfield. And a wonderful film version came out just a couple of years ago, which was directed by Armando Iannucci, which is terrific. Dickens' personal life takes a twist. He goes in 1857, Dickens gets involved in a play called The Frozen Deep, which was written by his writer friend Wilkie Collins. And to cut a fairly long story short, Dickens goes up to Manchester with the play. He's starring in the play, and they recruit local actresses in Manchester to play some of the parts. And one of the actresses that stars in the play is this young actress called Ellen Ternan, who was from a theatrical family. Dickens is in his early 40s at this point. She's 17, 18 years old, and Dickens falls hook, line, and sinker in love with Ellen Ternan. And this is the woman that becomes the invisible woman of Charles Dickens' life. And despite the fact that he is still married to Catherine Hogarth, who poor Catherine has, had 10 children by this point. She's grown very overweight. She's suffered terribly from multiple postnatal depressions, and effectively they have separated. And although we are celebrating Dickens today, that's the one part of Dickens' life that we can't overlook. He did treat his wife extremely badly during this whole period. And this building is, this street is Wellington Street in Covent Garden. And I show you that because the offices of the magazine Household Word was located at the bottom of the street. But in 1859, Dickens fell out with the publishers. Actually, he fell out with lots of people because of this clandestine affair with Ellen Ternan. And he decided to set up his own magazine, which he was going to own and publish and edit. And it was called All the Year Round. And you can see the blue plaque there on the wall on the right, which is on the building halfway up Wellington Street. Until a few years ago, this building was the Charles Dickens Coffee House. It's now a very nice, I have to say, wine bar. And this is where Dickens would have had his offices, just on that first floor, and he would have lived in a bachelor pad above the shop. So this was his London sort of bachelor pad. And in the magazine, All the Year Round, he publishes from 1859 to 1861, now in weekly installments, A Tale of Two Cities, which was his second historical novel, the first one being Barnaby Rudge. And this was based on Carlyle's History of the French Revolution. And of course, we all know the great opening. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of innocence. It was the age of foolishness. And this pub on the right, the Old Cheshire Cheese, which is just off Fleet Street, one of the oldest pubs in London, is where Charles Dawnay, one of the characters, is caught up in the chaos of the French Revolution. And the British barrister Sidney Carter takes Dawnay round to the Cheshire Cheese, having got him off during this trial at the Old Bailey. You'll have to read the novel to find out more about it. And they dine in this tavern, so you can experience, and they'll tell you that Dickens' chair is located next to the fireplace in the Old Cheshire Cheese. Now, speaking of, and there's the Cheshire Cheese again. Speaking of A Tale of Two Cities, I'm going to just stop for a moment because I'd like to introduce, if I may, our guest star today. And our guest star is actually David Tucker. David is my colleague, a guiding colleague and friend, and indeed the co-owner of London Walks, with whom we bring this tour to you today. And, well, David knows just about more about Dickens and knows London as well as Dickens would have known it. And he has a very special story to tell about his own experience with A Tale of Two Cities. So I'm just going to invite David to join us, if I may. Are you there, David? I think Robert's going to just make you co-host for a moment. Do I need to stop sharing my screen, Robert?
No, you're fine. I don't see him yet.
I think he's maybe listed under Mary in the
Oh, I see. Okay,
chat.
let me try that. Well, the problem is there's a lot of people. Oh, here we go, Mary. I was going to say the problem is there's a lot of people named Mary. Hold on, David. We'll get you in a second.
Mary Tucker. It's worth waiting for, folks. I can tell you, it's a great story that David has to tell. So I think we just need to unmute you and get you to turn your video on.
Should be coming on. There
you are, Dave. We can see you. There you are. Okay. Hi, David. Welcome.
Hi,
hey, welcome, David Tucker.
Thank you, Robert. Well, I'll race through this because this is really Simon's show.
No, take your time. Take your time. We're not in a rush.
Well, I did a podcast that tells the full tale earlier today. You can hear by my accent, I'm a Yank. As an undergraduate, my undergraduate hero was a guy named Alvin Whitley, who's from a small town in Texas, very bright, went to Harvard. And in 1951, he's 24 years old, 22. He's over here working on Keats. And he's looking at some papers, and he suddenly thinks, my God, I recognize that handwriting. It turns out he had done a Keats seminar at Harvard, and they looked at some facsimiles. And it was a poem, and it was a poem by Keats that no one knew about. So this guy had discovered a poem by Keats. Well, fast forward 25 years later, I'm a young graduate student in London, University College London. I'm doing my PhD not on Keats, but on Dickens. And I'm in the V&A. I'm doing a manuscript study, A Tale of Two Cities. I know a couple of you, Beth and Ken, said that it's your favorite Dickens novel. And I was collating the manuscript against the first published edition. This is very hard work. First of all, it's difficult to read someone else's handwriting, and you've got to do it very, very carefully. You read 3 words of the manuscript, and then you move your eye over to the published edition. You read those same 3 words. And what you're looking for is changes, because the way he worked, the way novelists work, they write the manuscript, they send the manuscript off to the printer. The printer prints what they call proofs. That goes back to the novelist, and then he basically proofreads. That's where we get the word proofread from. He corrects it, he makes any alterations, etc., etc. So if you're doing what I was doing, it was like looking over the shoulder of Charles Dickens when he was working on the proof stage. That in itself is very exciting. And you know, when you find a difference, a change in the first published edition from the manuscript, then you're onto something. You can see the alteration that he's made. But it gets better. At 3 points in that manuscript, I suddenly realized the paper felt funny. It was heavier, it was thicker. And I thought, what's going on here? What is this all about? And then suddenly I realized, normally when he wanted to make a change, he would cross out, and the fancy word is he would interline. He would write the revision directly above the line that he had crossed out, or sometimes directly below. But in 3 cases, the changes he wanted to make were so extensive that he got a blank sheet of paper, he cut it to the right size, and he pasted it over the bit that he had written previously. And then he's writing on a blank piece of paper. And I suddenly understood what had happened. I can remember taking it up to the desk, summoning the head librarian. And when he came out, I said, look, clearly this is what has happened. If you can get your conservation department to lift this off, and I was very careful about that verb. I use that plural, or that noun, pronoun. I use that plural noun. We will, because it was my discovery, we will have brought to light something that Charles Dickens wrote that no one has seen, and no one else has ever seen, apart from Charles Dickens himself in 1859. And sure enough, 6 weeks later, I get this letter. I loved it. It was so British, so stiffly formal. It said, dear Mr. Tucker, the materials you requested to see are now ready for your inspection. Well, you know, it may have been the best Dickens discovery of that decade. I, of course, got it published. And it was just for a young man who had at that time scholarly aspirations, it was thrilling. It actually provided my own trade of London walks. Ian, who owned it at the time, did not want an American guide, but I knew a little bit about Dickens. And Dickens is extremely important to me. Dickens is really the reason I'm in London. And I mean, if you follow it right through, Dickens, in fact, is the reason my children exist. Okay, that's it for me.
So they were doing copying, pasting even back then.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, Robert.
That's fantastic. Isn't that the most wonderful story? I just, that's why I had to get David to join us today and tell that story. And because
it is very touching. David, are you going to stay on the call for a little bit?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it would be great if you could tell the folks more about London walks when Simon's done.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so we just have a few more minutes, not too many minutes left. So I'm just going to share my screen once again for the final furlong. So here we go. That's it. Yeah, just a couple of seconds there. Okay, so hot on the heels of Tale of Two Cities, we have what I have to say personally is my favorite novel, probably because it's the first one I read. I guess you always have a fondness for the first one that you read. And here it is, Great Expectations, which was again written in weekly serial format in this magazine. Go to Covent Garden today. We've got the Apple store right in the heart of Covent Garden. People queue around the block to get the latest iPhone, 13, 14, whatever it is right now. But back in the 19th century, people would have been queuing up outside that building on Wellington Street for the latest installment of A Tale of Two Cities or Great Expectations or whatever it was. So just imagine that, queues of people around the block. And actually, the magazine continued until Dickens' death. He was editing it still almost until the day that he died. And in fact, I just learned this recently. David knows this story, but apparently some American entrepreneur was threatened to demolish or buy the house on Wellington Street and take it brick by brick and have it rebuilt in Chicago. Although thankfully that didn't happen. But anyway, I mentioned that Dickens kind of embarked on this, well, I suppose maybe even it's a third career at this point, but he, about 10 years after he writes Christmas Carol, December 1853, he's invited up to Birmingham to address a crowd of people. Now, having been, I think, spurred on by or encouraged by his friends, he thinks, right, I'm going to read from A Christmas Carol. And this was a huge success. And this reading his work out loud, he does for the rest of his life. And for the first few years, the money that he raised went to charity. And then I think largely because he bought this beautiful villa out in Kent called Gad's Hill, he needed to pay for that. So then the money goes into Dickens' own pocket. But he made more money from the public readings of his novels than he made from the novels themselves. And when you think about, a book tour today, it's part and parcel of a writer's life, isn't it? The literary festivals, it's your agent makes you do all these things, but no one had ever really done this before. So again, it was very innovative. But of course, because he was an actor, he performed the stories. He didn't just read them out. And in fact, he had a special edition of A Christmas Carol, which he marked up just as an actor would mark up a script. This is just tickets that you could get for the readings. On the right, you can see Dickens reading from a lectern. And in fact, he had a special table, a lectern made for the readings. And I'm just going to go back to Doughty Street again to the Dickens Museum. And one of the great treasures of the museum's collection is, in fact, this lectern. You can see it. So you can kind of see that in the museum. 1863 to 65, Dickens writes Our Mutual Friend, which was really, well, it was his last full-length novel that he completed and the last London novel. And what's kind of interesting about this is that Dickens is in quite a lot of pain physically at this point, mainly due to overwork, stress, all these deadlines, and lots of characters in Mutual Friend have disabilities and physical pain. So he particularly had trouble with his foot. He suffered with gout. He suffered from depression, sort of on and off during his life. On the 9th of June 1865, he was involved in this terrible railway disaster called the Staplehurst Railway disaster. And remember, he was a big fan of the railways. He travelled all over the country on the trains. But he was coming back actually from, a visit to France with his mistress, Ellen Ternan. Due to a signalling mistake, the trains came off the carriages came off the viaduct and plunged into the river valley below, and many people died. And Dickens was a hero because he actually administered to the dead and the dying during that time. I believe he was carrying one of the manuscripts for Our Mutual Friend on the journey back. This is a photograph that I think was taken when Dickens goes back to America between 1867, late 1867, early 1868. And you can see how tired and, old-looking he is by this point. The beard, by the way, was grown for the play The Frozen Deep that I mentioned back a little bit earlier in the talk. Here's an image of the reading tour. Now, Dickens was, again, phenomenally successful. When he went to DC, actually, President Johnson had tickets for his family every night to hear Dickens read. And when he went to Boston on the 24th of December, 1867, Christmas Eve, he read from A Christmas Carol. And there's a wonderful apocryphal story about a factory owner being so moved by the story that he gave all of his employees the next day off and sent them home with a turkey. He then built on those public readings and actually created he dramatized the terrible scene of the murder of Nancy from Oliver Twist, which is still one of those violent descriptions of a murder in literature. And this is something he performed to great acclaim at these public readings, the death of Nancy. And his doctors by this point, by the way, are warning him. They're telling him not to perform because it's going to kill him. And this is an image, we think one of the very last images we have, St. James's Hall, where Dickens gave his final public readings in the spring of 1870. He read from Christmas Carol, he read The Trial from the Pickwick Papers, and he'd suffered some kind of minor stroke at this point because his speech was slurred. And after he finished his reading on the 15th of March, the very last one here at this hall, which was just off Piccadilly, he said, "From these garish lights, I vanish now for evermore with a heartfelt, grateful, respectful, and affectionate farewell." And the audience they just stood up, thunderous applause, and he actually collapsed backstage after this particular performance. He is halfway, about 6 installments into his unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, when he dies at his home in the countryside, Gad's Hill in Kent. There's the death certificate. And he dies, as you see, of apoplexy, which, of course, was really the term for a stroke back then. And curiously enough, he died on the 9th of June, 1870, 5 years to the day that he'd been involved in that railway crash in Staplehurst in Kent. And there was a national outpouring of grief. That's from the Illustrated Police News from the 16th of June, 1870, after Dickens, a couple of days after Dickens' funeral. And one of my favorite stories is that a little girl in Covent Garden, Covent Garden is mentioned just about more often than any other location in Dickens' novels, and a little flower girl overhears 2 men talking about the death of Dickens, and she goes up to them and says, "Charles Dickens dead? Will Father Christmas die as well?" And that just kind of shows you the impact that Dickens had just on, every person, every strata of society. And just to finish, here's a painting called Dickens' Dream, which shows you his, some of his 2,000 characters that he created in those 14 and a half novels, sitting at his desk. And I just thought I would finish with a quote from the Pickwick Papers, which perhaps we need at the moment, given this, awful world situation. There are dark shadows on the earth, but its lights are. Thank you very much for your attention this afternoon. I'm going to come out of my screen. I'm going to
bravo.
Thank you. Well, a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I hope that's given you a little flavour and just remind us, of the brilliance of the great man. If you haven't picked up that Dickens novel in a while, or you haven't, now's the opportunity to do so. And hopefully, the most important thing is, ladies and gentlemen, when we're all ready to travel again, you'll all come to London, you'll all join us on London walks, and we'll take you on the Dickens trail in real life.
Yeah, we're going to do that. So we're going to plan a group trip to London, and you and David can show us around and check out these sites in person.
Fantastic. Great. And don't forget, folks, we've got London Walks. We've got over 200 now. I think it's 200 plus virtual tours, sometimes 3 or 4 a day at the moment. So if you're hungry for more, go to the London Walks website, walks.com. I think Robert's going to provide a link.
Slide. Can you pull up the
slide? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes,
I should have. I'll just do that. Let me just do that. Yeah, I'll bring up the information again so you can note it down. I should have.
And I hope you didn't mind, but Simon, I posted in the event description that you're having your Valentine's walk coming up next weekend.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, next weekend. That's right. 13th and 14th. Love in London, we're calling it, and that's what we need at the moment. Don't we all need, we all need loving up in a big way. So yeah, it's going to be a nice one. We're going to be going to the art galleries, seeing love paintings. We're going to be talking about Shakespeare's sonnets. Oh, it's going to be, a feel good virtual tour. So those are the details, folks. So we've got walks.com, and you can link up to all the virtual tours that London Walks are offering. And you can follow me on Instagram if you want to. Follow London Walks on Instagram, Twitter, and we look forward to seeing you. Yes, whenever we get the chance.
If you've got
any questions, I'll try and answer any questions.
Okay.
Sorry, David.
Go
ahead.
Our folks a little bit about London Walks.
The oldest urban walking tour on the planet. Mary and I own it, but it's effectively run almost as a guides cooperative. It's kind of run on a profit share basis. Which means we're able to attract and keep amazingly good guides. You just had one of the brightest stars in the constellation tonight. I think it's a very, very special thing we've got going here. So, but we need help. I mean, if you can spread the word, folks, it's been really bad for us. We're a walking tour company that can't do walking tours apart from these virtuals. So.
And some of us were on David's tour that he did a few weeks ago on the Kensington in London. Are you going to be doing that again some point in the future?
Yeah, that'll be running most Saturdays. I think the next time is 2 weeks in the future. I've got a couple tales I'm dying to tell.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, this is just one about. This is just not known at all. It flabbergasted me when I discovered this. 48 Dowty Street, known today as the Dickens House Museum, in 1912, I think it was. That was for single women, a sort of hostel, and staying there was a young Canadian suffragette named Mary Richardson. And it's Mary Richardson who got up one morning. I can't get over this. Dickens's house. She got up one morning and she put her arm in a sort of sling and she put a couple of knives in there. And off she went to the National Gallery. And she took the knife out and she slashed the Rokeby Venus. This was to try to bring attention to the suffragette movement, and she's really known as Slasher Mary. It's just such an extraordinary thing. I mean, this isn't well known at all. Everyone knows it as the Dickens House Museum, but the idea that Slasher Mary was staying in what had been Dickens's house 50, 60 years earlier, before she went on that run. It's just an extraordinary thing.
There was some, I know some questions in the chat, Robert. One of the questions was, who did the illustrations for Dickens novels? Well, actually, I'm sorry, I just hear myself echoing at the moment. It varied. Initially, it was a guy who went by the name of Fizz. So if Dickens was Boz, then his illustrator was Hablot Brown, who was known as Fizz. An artist called Marcus Stone also did some of the illustrations. A guy called George Cruikshank did many of them. But David, you probably got some, probably add to that. But yeah, so I guess the answer is he worked with different illustrators at different times. And somebody asked if there were living descendants of Dickens today, and the answer is yes. In fact, well, he had 10 children, and I don't know how many descendants exactly, but I can tell you I know one of them personally. David, I think, knows her too. Lucinda Hawksley, who is the great, four greats, I think it is, granddaughter of Henry Dickens. And she is a very accomplished author herself and art historian, and has written many fine books on of course Dickens herself. So yeah, Lucinda Hawksley is somebody we know who is a direct descendant of Dickens.
And the City of London Pickwick Club, Mr. Pickwick is, I think it's his great grandson, Ian Dickens. So I'm a member of that club.
Oh yes, Ian Dickens, that's right.
What about David? Just switching topics. How many different, like during a normal year, how many different topics does London Walks do tours on? It's an incredible high number.
Yeah, it's a great question. Before this happened, there were something like 500 different London walks. This is a testimony to, one, the creativity of the guides, but also, London's long and extremely rich history. But I think there's a lot more now. I mean, Simon's right. There's about now 200, and we're adding these 200 of these virtual tours. And this has been a breakout thing for us. We're now doing virtual tours on things that, we just would not have thought of doing. It would have been impossible to do when we were just confining ourselves to, our remit was a walking tour. It had to be places that you could walk to. So we've got a guide who's going to do one on the Bayeux Tapestry, which is, he describes it as the longest cartoon in the world. He's an extraordinary guy. He's an American from the Boston area. And he writes guidebooks. And, that will be a wonderful tour. And we're going overseas now. We've done one in Rome and one in Venice, and there's one coming in Florence, and we did one in Athens. Paris Walks is not really operating, and we're very close to them. So we are going to provide the platform for some of their guides to do virtual tours in Paris. So there's just, I'm really almost overwhelmed by the creativity of these people. They just keep coming up with ideas, and they're just running away with it. I mean, it's wildly exciting. I just wish it wasn't so disastrous in other respects. So
I was just saying to a friend today, actually, she's an actor, and I said, we're storytellers, and if we don't have stories to tell, then we're nothing. So we have to find a way of telling the stories just in a creative way, and that's what we've been doing.
Exactly.
Otherwise, we kind of we dry up. Yeah. Somebody just said, despite his lack of formal education, how did Dickens get his amazing vocabulary? Well, I mean, David probably better off to answer this really, but I mean, of course, he was extremely well read as a child. He read, of course, voraciously, but also he had an amazing ear. I mean, he was like Professor Higgins. He went round. I remember he walked for hours and hours after supper every night, and he would listen to the hot chestnut sellers and the crossing street sweepers and every level of society, and he could capture their dialect and their accent. just like Higgins, and he could transcribe it. I mean, that's just one aspect. David could probably, expand on that much further, but
I think there was almost something genetic there. I mean, his father was a good storyteller. He had a grandmother who was a good storyteller. And I think there was also, even though they were I guess you could just about call them little lower middle class. I think there was a maid, especially when he was very young and impressionable. An older woman, and she told him she was a good storyteller. So
and
there
she
was
sort of
all
told him
that.
quite almost like quite scary sort of
That's
horror
right.
stories, didn't
That's
she?
right.
Yeah.
And again, there was that thing, and this is quite common as well in some writers. There was that time he was a sort of sickly, weak child, and he just read. He read a lot anyway, but there was a period when he was fairly ill, and he read just nonstop at that time. And I think some of that vocabulary came from that. Some of that way with words, that facility with language.
And somebody's also added on to that by saying, how did he create such fabulous names? Well, the thing is, if you go to the Victorian Albert Museum, I mean, you can actually see his notes. I mean, absolutely incredibly. And he would try out maybe 8, 9, 10 different versions of a character's name before he got exactly the right, name. Actually, Mrs. Pipchin, who I think I read a little bit of Mrs. Pipchin out to you, I think she started out as Mrs. Tipchin and then Mrs. Pipchit and Mrs. So he just worked at it. I think, J.K. Rowling is a sort of, in a way, a modern kind of equivalent, who, if you think about the names, her wonderful characters in Harry Potter, I think she plays around in exactly the same way and she owes an awful lot to Dickens, obviously. And also he would physicalize his characters. And this is his daughter, I think it was Katie, said that he would leap up in front of the mirror in Dowty Street in the drawing room, and he would literally physicalize the character before he could put it down. So he was like a method, like a method actor. He was like a method writer. I find that fascinating, don't you?
He was also, like you, Simon, he was an actor.
Yeah.
I think that he talked the words onto the page and talked the words off the page. When you do that, your ear comes into play. The cadence of language, for example. If you keep your lips shut, you're just seeing the thing with your eyes, and the ear is so important. He had that, actors feel for language and ability, and I think that's one of the reasons those names are so brilliant. Yes. Not just the names, but the language generally. This is an actor.
I think he said about A Christmas Carol, he said the very best way to appreciate A Christmas Carol was to read it out loud in a cold room with candlelight. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you could still do that now in February, couldn't you? At home, you could sort of, gather people. Maybe harder to do virtually, I don't know, but you could get people on Zoom and you could all kind of read a bit.
Awesome. So here's what I'm going to do. I'll email out. So we tried to record the program. If it worked, I'll include that in the email I send out. And then again, Simon's having this Valentine's weekend tour. I'll email that out as well if you want to join it. And then David, he does this really cool tour about the Kensington that I like so much. I actually went on it twice. And so I'll include that in the email as well. So I'll send out an email to you folks, but if you're still on the call today, but I won't probably be able to do it until tomorrow because I have a couple other programs later today. So stay tuned and I'll email all of you tomorrow.
And thank you once again on our behalf for joining us today, and thanks for helping us to celebrate the inimitable Charles Dickens.
Yeah, you all have to do us one last favor. Everyone's going to need to go eat a piece of birthday cake.
Yes.
Yes, and drink a pint of champagne. He regularly drank a pint of champagne before he did his readings. So drink a pint of champagne.
All right. Awesome. Well, thanks, everyone. Take care. Thanks, David. Good to see you again.
You.
Hi, Simon.
Really nice to see you,
Thank you, Robert.
Take care.
We'll be in touch later this week, Robert. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. Yep. I'll catch up with you in a day or two. Thanks, everyone. Take care.